I want us to write just real quick, we have these 5 responses, but as you have gone through grief, as you have gone through loss, or you have watched others go through it, what are some of the feelings and the emotions that come with it? What do you think? What are some of the feelings and emotions that come with it? Yeah.
I think mostly the loss.
Yeah. Have that empty sense of loss.
I was going to say emptiness.
Emptiness. Good. Did you have your hand up too? Okay. Confusion. Yeah. Shock. Overwhelming sorrow. Regrets. That's a big one. That's a big one. We're going to talk about that one. Guilt. All the what ifs. It was literally years, and even this year, it still hit me at different points. It's now been 5 years since Tiffany passed away. And that, for me, months 8 to 12 after Tiffany passed away were really hard. Because I was reliving, I could tell you what day I made what decision that impacted her health. I could tell you, this week this happened, this week this happened, this week this happened. And my mind would start to play all of the what ifs. Well, what if I would have made that decision? What if I would have done, what if? And then, boy, what is that? It's like this spiral, right? This downward spiral that when I allow myself to go down these emotional roads, that, boy, I get myself in trouble. And so, one of the things, in order for us to understand loss, we need to understand the pressures of loss. We need to understand, what does a person go through in grief? What does a person go through in loss? What are all of those pressures that are coming down upon the person? And as we understand those pressures, then that gives us a bigger scope and an understanding of what is happening, that then allows us to have, okay, now what are then those perspectives of those pressures, and then how do I need to purposely respond to those pressures based upon those perspectives? Because when we go through grief, when we go through loss, we are going to hit those. Now, the other important thing as we begin to discuss the different pressures of loss is that we need to understand that grief and loss is unique to every person. So the grief that I went through in losing a spouse is different than the grief that my mother-in-law went through in losing a daughter. Her best friend, her cohort, her confidant. They had become very close friends through the years. So her loss, though, was different than my father-in-law's loss. Because he's losing his baby girl. He's losing his joy. And what we felt and how we responded were different. My father-in-law and I were like, pull out the pictures, get them out. We sit there, we'd go through the pictures, we would laugh, we would cry, we would laugh, we would cry. My mother-in-law is sitting over there. I don't want to see any pictures. Does that mean she's wrong and we're right? It just means we're different. We're processing the loss differently. And what's hard is when we begin to say, okay, here are the different stages of loss. What do we begin to do? We begin to make it all the same, don't we? And we think that, so then when this person isn't following this right process of loss, well, now there's something wrong with them. Oh, wait a second. No, there's something wrong with me. And now that leads to a whole nother set of issues. The fact is, all of us will experience loss at one time or another. Sometimes it comes suddenly. Just 2 weeks ago, I did a memorial service for a man in his early 30s, adopted 2 girls and had one of their third. Died in a car accident caused by his friend. Now she's a single mom with 3 girls, 14 and below. Wow. That's heavy. That's heavy. Sometimes it's sudden. Sometimes it's gradual. I watched my wife die over the course of 20 years. It's hard. Sometimes it's quick, but not too quick. Cancer comes, 3 months later, the person is gone. And so we need to recognize the uniqueness of loss and the different things that come together. What we're going to look at now is going to show us why it's unique to every person. And what we want to do is there's 5 basic pressures that I have kind of brought the different pressures down to for us to look at. And I'm sure we could come up with some others, but I think these 5 different categories of pressures basically kind of summarize all of the different pressures that we feel in the midst of grief, that we feel in the midst of loss. And so the pressures of loss, it's important for us to begin to identify what are all of these different pressures of loss. Because as we identify them, then we're able to do something with them. What happens in loss and grief is that we get into this spiral where we're just basing everything upon all that we feel and not upon the realities of what are there. So we see here the very first pressure of loss is that it brings emotional pressures. This is the one, almost all of the things that we talked about in the different category or the different, the feelings and the things we go through in loss, it fits in this emotional pressure. And so what are some of the different emotional pressures that it brings? Emotional responses are unique to every individual and are expressed in different manners. And so even though you and I may be experiencing the same emotion, how we express it may be differently. It's the way that God has created humanity is that we're not all the same. We're not all a bunch of robots. We have different makeups, our different personalities. And some person is quiet and they hold on to something, and the other person is just, you know what they're thinking. You know what they're feeling. But they're both experiencing the same emotion. And so emotional responses are unique to every individual and are expressed in different manners. Emotional responses are unpredictable and may hit at any moment. Okay, give you an example. Okay, in 2008, my wife Tiffany and I got to do a trip to Alaska. I was preaching at a camp up there and some different meetings. And one of my favorite pictures of Tiffany is on a bridge in downtown Fairbanks, and it's one of my favorite pictures of her. And in fact, it was the picture that was on my iPad probably for almost 2 years after she passed away. And the other day, I was in Fairbanks preaching at the church again, but 2 years ago, the Lord allowed me to meet somebody who I married, and she was from Fairbanks. And so we were downtown Fairbanks doing pictures as a family. Yvonne, my wife now, she had a 10-year-old son, and I adopted Elijah. And so we wanted to go down to downtown Fairbanks and do some pictures. So as I'm walking along with Yvonne and Elijah, and we're walking towards the courthouse, because Elijah wants to get a picture in front of the courthouse because that's where I adopted him. And he's like, I want a picture in front of the courthouse. I see the bridge of my favorite picture of Tiffany. It's like, shoo! Right back to 2008. And we never know when those emotional things are going to hit us. A couple months after Tiffany had passed away, I jump in my car to go home from a late night thing. I jump in my car, and always my first thing before is I would jump in my car, I would grab my phone and send her a text. A couple months later, I jump in my phone, I grab my phone, and I start to send a text. Where did that come from? And if you've been through loss, you're probably remembering your own, yeah, that happened. And you realize it's just unpredictable when these emotional things are going to hit you. And you don't know when it's going to hit you, and it just can come out of nowhere. And then these emotional responses, what do? They pile on all at once, creating a collection of emotions that are overwhelming, an overwhelming sense of loss. Overwhelming anxiety, depression, lack of caring at times. You say, well, then I don't care anymore. The extremes, the rain clouds that suddenly appear. You're doing fine, it's been a good day, and all of a sudden it's like the rain cloud of tears coming, and you have a downpour. Anger, grief, and then more grief, regret, second guessing, being overwhelmed. All of these things that just build up, and these emotional responses pile on. Guilt is one of the major emotional battles that people face. Did I do the right thing? Was it the right decision? We live in that what if mode. I told you about, for me, that what ifs. What if I would have done this? What if I would have done that? What if I would have, and we live in that what if mode. Last words that were filled with conflict. Did I do everything that I could have done? It's important for us to be able to identify the difference between true guilt and false guilt in this emotional pressure. So there are some things that are true guilt, okay? So true guilt is when I feel guilty over sin that I have done, over doing something that truly would violate what God would want. False guilt is me feeling guilty about something that I cannot control and that I cannot do, and that even sometimes I feel false guilt because I feel like I could have made the decision. And it's that looking back and feeling guilty about the things that we did or didn't do. And it's not connected to a rightness or wrongness in dealing with a sin issue. So in dealing with loss, sometimes harsh words are said, and it's the last thing you said to the person. You had a wrong response to them. And so now I feel guilt. Okay? So there is that true guilt, that I feel guilt over my sin, but then once I make that right with my God and I have forgiveness, now every time I bring that up, what is it now? It's false guilt. Because I have made that right. I've taken responsibility. But then we deal with the issue of false guilt, that in loss, there's all kinds of false guilt. All kinds of false guilt. And we feel false guilt about, maybe we should have spent more time doing this. Maybe we should have done this. Maybe and this what if, and I feel guilty that I didn't make the decisions that I should have made, or I didn't say what I should have said, or I didn't, whatever you fill in the blank in your situation. And false guilt then leads to many other issues. It leads to things where now I am struggling emotionally with these things. And I have a list here of things that where false guilt can come from. I no longer have to pay all that money for the medical bills. Now I can go do something fun with that money. False guilt. No longer have to spend all the time helping with all the treatments. Tiffany, her last 3 years of her life, she literally spent 50% of the time on IV drugs, most of that at home. She had to spend 3 to 4 hours a day in breathing treatments just to stay healthy during her life. I would have to, there's a pounding on her back and all this stuff, and now Now I don't have to spend all that time helping take care of them, and I feel guilty. A sense of relief for them and for you. Those who are doing the caregiving, and you feel almost relieved that they're no longer experiencing the pain, and then you feel guilty because you felt relief. And it's false guilt. I could have prevented it. Essentially, false guilt encompasses the issues that are beyond our control or past our ability to control. And so this false guilt, as we work through it, it's very important that we identify what is true guilt and what is false guilt. The next thing then, what does loss bring? It brings then the pressure of physical pressures. What would be some of the physical pressures that somebody goes through in grief? Just as you think about it, what would be some of the pressures?
Don't sleep.
Okay, don't sleep well.
Financial.
Yep. And financial, I think there's another pressure here that we talk about, the personal pressure, and there's a lot of financial pressures that come in with it, but that can also bring some of the physical things as well. Appetite? Have you ever noticed that stress brings physical issues into your life? You know how many of the different diagnoses now deal with this issue of stress? And how can you control this stress? Things like fibromyalgia and things where it seems, and grieving is one of the most stressful things you can go through. I was warned by a couple of different people who had lost a spouse. David, probably your first 6 months are going to be your sickest months of your life. Because it was just the process of which my body was dealing with grief. And they were right. I had gone the previous 10 years without a sick day at work. The next 6 months, I was having to visit doctors, they couldn't find anything wrong with me, but I was going through pain that I had never experienced before. They were running tests, and it brought those physical pressures.
Oh, I was just going to say ulcers. After I lost my little brother to cancer, I physically had ulcers in my body that I had never experienced before.
Yeah. See, when you go through grief, not only is there the emotional pressure, but there's also the physical pressure. It is the lack of sleep. It is the stress that comes. And it is all of those physical things that come with grieving and how your body thinks.
How long it was before you felt like you actually slept well through the night?
For me,
Yeah, I remember you saying that once for how long it was, 8 months or something, or a year or something.
no, I slept okay.
You were afraid of restful sleep, like waking up in the morning and feeling rested.
Yeah, it was probably in that 8 months range where, because of Tiffany's CF, I was constantly waking up in the middle of the night to change out IVs and all of this stuff. And it was probably somewhere in that 6 to 8 months that I finally was like, oh wow, I feel rested. It just took my body a long time to get consistent sleep. And so some people sleep well, some people don't sleep well. But it's really hard to sleep when you lose a spouse and you roll over and you see an empty pillow. Now you're dealing with all the emotional pressures. Now you're adding the physical pressure. Now it's really hard to sleep when you say goodnight to all your kids, but you don't get to say goodnight to that one anymore. It's hard to go to sleep on that thought.
The biggest thing for me lately, since I lost a couple of, well, 3 people this summer already, and it's the what if thing that does keep me up at night. You and I know full well God controls all of that, but that what if thing for a control freak is,
Yeah.
and just what if I'd done this, what if I'd done that, what if I'd seen those signs earlier?
And it's really hard. And you begin to see that these pressures are kind of intertwined. They almost feed each other, the emotional and the physical. So we have emotional pressure, we have physical pressure. The next type of pressure is that we have relational pressures. When I lost my spouse, I lost my wife, it changed almost every relationship in my life. Because she was the one I was closest to, and all of my friends had relationships with David and Tiffany. And now they're trying to figure out how it is. My secretary and my wife were really good friends, and they worked hard at having a really good relationship because of how closely we worked and things like that. And so now my relationship with my secretary changes. She used to be in all the know of everything that was going on in my life, but now it's different. It's different. Because she's not the one that I need to go share my emotional struggles with. And so all of those relationships, it begins to impact relationships with in-laws, relationships with other family members, relationships with brothers and sisters, relationships with other good friends. I've had more than one person talk to me in dealing with grief that's like, boy, it seemed like I had all these friends before, and we would do all this stuff together and all these things, and now I don't get asked anything. I feel like I've been abandoned because they're like, well, is it appropriate to ask them to come over for like a game night if they've just gone through all this loss? Boy, I don't know if it would be appropriate to have frivolity, so I'm just not going to ask them because I don't want to hurt them. And it just changes all of those relationships. All of these friendships are going to be impacted. It's easy for the person experiencing loss and tragedy to have an improper view of what people are doing or saying because of all the other pressures of life, especially the emotional pressures. Everything is raw and overwhelming, turning small or unintended things into big things, bringing pressures to the relationships. Those going through loss must not have unrealistic expectations on others. This was a hard one for me to realize. And so I was in a very public position as a pastor when I lost my wife. And I knew I was going to get asked lots of questions. And one of the questions I knew that I would get asked about was whether I was going to remarry or not. So my wife had been dead less than 12 hours when the first person asked me or talked to me about remarriage. I went away for a month. When I came back, I didn't make it to my church door before somebody sat down and talked with me about remarriage. At that point, for the next 2 years, almost every other week, I was asked about remarriage. But were those people who were asking about remarriage being hateful or mean to me?
They want to fix your problem.
Yeah, they want to fix my problem because they think marriage is going to make me happy again. They think, well, if you just get married, then you can, my unfavorite words, I can move on. Don't say those words to me. And so what I had to do in the midst of my grief and in the midst of my emotional turmoil, I had to recognize that those people had good intentions. They were trying to be a comfort to me. They were trying to help me. They weren't trying to hurt me. And so I had to choose in this relational pressure to take what I viewed as stupid comments as they love me. And so I came up with a standard answer. Whenever somebody asked me, I would tell them I'm praying that God would put me in the status of life most usable by Him, which basically said, it's none of your business, leave me alone. In a very nice way. It's up to God. It's not up to you. And so it put all of these relational pressures there upon the situation. And so we see then the emotional pressures, We see the physical pressures, we see the relational pressures, and how it changes the relationships that I go through. Relationships with my siblings. My sister became a stalwart of emotional strength. If I was driving down the road in a wreck, I would call Shannon. Shannon! And I would cry. She'd listen to me, cry with me. It created a bond that is very tight between my sister and I. Sometimes relationships go good, sometimes relationships go bad, because it brings those relational pressures. And so we just need to recognize that loss is going to do that. Loss not only brings that emotional, physical, and relational, but it also brings personal pressures. It brings those personal pressures. The personal pressures are what the person faces in their personal, private life as a consequence of the loss and tragedy. Depending upon the loss or the tragedy, it may affect the entire direction of one's life. A widow who has never worked outside of the home now has to go find a job. An adult child who loses her parents who moved in with her to take care of them, what is she going to do now? Parents who lose their only child, an accident that takes away the ability to do your occupation. These are just a few examples of how loss drastically impacts one's future. Loss also then brings the financial pressures that you mentioned. 2 incomes to 1 income. 1 income to 0 income. It also brings sometimes the pressure of, now how do I deal with all of the money, because now I just got a $500,000 life insurance policy. So before I had 0 money, and now because of an insurance policy, I have all this money. If you've had no money, you think $500,000 is a lot of money. But guess what? $500,000, if you're not making any other money, is not a lot of money. It can go very quickly. And that often happens to people who think, oh, I've got all this money. They go buy a new vehicle and they do this and they take this big trip and they quit their job. And 2 years later, they're like, what do I do now? I have 0 money again. And there's all of these financial pressures that come with it. Other personal pressures may include work-related pressures, living without help, dealing with personal possessions, appropriately moving forward, and life decisions that are now made without having to consider the person that you lost, which many times is accompanied with guilt, because now I'm not considering that person. And so how do I figure out what to do with all of Tiffany's stuff? All of her clothes. She was a musician. I mean, file drawers and file drawers and file drawers of music. What do I do with her grad school diploma? What do I do? And the list goes on. And it brings up all of these relational pressures these personal pressures that before I never went through before. It then also not only brings personal pressures, but it brings spiritual pressures. And the 5th pressure that it brings is these spiritual pressures. It's allowing all of these other pressures mentioned before to define our life rather than resting in God. Because now I'm a widower. I'm a widower at 35. Does that define who I am? It's easy for me to allow that to define who I am. A person is tempted to question God's goodness, His sovereignty, His loving kindness. How could a loving God take a woman who spent her life serving Him and kill her at 35? Is that really good? Is that really loving kindness? And now, spiritually, I'm faced with all of these questions, and I'm tempted to question God's goodness. Sinful responses are easily justified in a person's thinking. Sometimes by well-intentioned people, even Christians, one is led to believe that unbiblical responses are just part of the response, or just part of the process of dealing with grief. I ran into a situation where 2 guys were challenging me to finish my doctorate, my dissertation, and in the midst of Tiffany's health stuff, I just like, you know what, that's not a high priority in life right now. And they were like, you know, David, you should do it in memory of Tiffany. Tiffany would want you to do it. And I lost it. I was like, how dare you use the death of my wife to manipulate me to try to get this done? And I mean, I unbiblically let them have it. And spiritually, I have just now violated what God desires of David. So what did I have to do? I had to go and apologize to those two men. So you know what? I responded incorrectly. It would have been really easy for me to justify my reaction. Now, I still believe that they shouldn't have done what they did, and they still to this day don't recognize that what they did was wrong or inappropriate, and they've never apologized to me for it, but I can't control them. But it's two guys that love me. I mean, they would do anything for me. But I have to take care of my own personal sin. Lack of sleep leads to late nights of thinking that spiral downward. What if? You know, and boy, it's easy to do that. Intense grief can lead to I don't care attitude, not only about physical things, but then about spiritual things. The inner man is in turmoil. Psalm chapter 13 is one of my favorite psalms. In Psalm chapter 13, David is crying out to God, and it's like, God, how long are you going to forget me? Forever? Lord, where are you? Where are you? Are you going to forget me? And it can lead to this inner turmoil. And sometimes motivations to do what you know needs to be done is not there, resulting in a walk with God falling by the wayside. And I lose my hope in God. And so as we think about loss, these are the 5 basic pressures of loss. What we're going to do is we're going to take a break here. And then we're going to come back and say, okay, so now then what should our responses be to the loss that I'm experiencing? What is our purposeful responses? Because we've identified some of the pressures. But now we want to stop and ask, okay, so how do I respond?